welcome to another episode of This Week in Cleantech, a roundup of the week's biggest stories you need to know in climate and clean energy in 15 minutes or less. Today is Friday, June 7th, 2024. I'm Renewable Energy World Editor-in-Chief John Engel. Dharna Norr from The Guardian will be joining us shortly, but for now, I'm joined by my good colleague and friend, Mike Casey of TigerCom. Hey, Mike. I just love seeing your smiling face once a week.
You could barely spit those words out, John.
That was tough. That was tough.
I've
got family coming to town today and through the weekend, so you know how that is. You're in that mad dash to get everything done and still be a productive employee, and so you might get a little bit more sass than even normal.
That's saying something. Well, my friend, I'm in the same boat. My son graduates on Tuesday, and I've got 7 family members additional coming to our house in the next 48 hours.
Sounds awful.
Right, listen, you do it once. I'm not leaving the master bedroom, so I'm all set. You know, right. I get to all set, man.
Good. All right. We want to thank our listeners who have been sending in those story recommendations and nominations for Cleantecher of the Week. You can do that by emailing us at rew@clarionevents.com, and we have a link to that email in the episode description as well. All right, Mike, let's get going.
Let's do this. Okay, number 1, we have a story from Dan Garino, who's been a guest on the show, from Inside Climate News, titled "Renewable Energy Wins for Now in Michigan as Local Control Measure Fails to Make Ballot." John?
Yeah, this one got you all jacked up this week. Last year, Michigan passed a law limiting the ability of local governments to block solar and wind projects. Opponents under the name Citizens for Local Choice responded by launching a campaign to put a referendum on the ballot that would repeal that law, but last week they ran out of time to gather enough signatures. The organization said they will continue their campaign, working to secure placement on the 2026 ballot. Governor Whitmer now has at least 2 years to convince voters that the law will help Michigan reach their clean energy goals, bring in new jobs and other economic benefits. All right, Mike, I'm winding you up. Now, go.
I said no.
Yeah.
Right there, the no pen on Kevin Martis here. All right, 20 of Michigan's 83 counties have passed ordinances blocking or delaying wind and solar projects. Since last year, over 24 clean energy projects have been blocked in the state. And the guy at the heart of those efforts was the Midwest's leading fossil fuel bro, Kevin Martis. Martis has been an inveterate professional operative with longstanding fossil fuel ties, working to deny farmers the right to use their land as they see fit and rural communities the job-creating benefits of clean energy. So let's be very clear. Very clear. Kevin Martis pushed this ballot initiative, and he lost. But when the story ran in Inside Climate News, Kevin Martis was mysteriously absent from the quote lineup. So not so fast, Mr. Martis. You face planted in front of the whole room, and pretending like you didn't doesn't remove the red from your face or the laughter from the room. Michiganders want clean energy, and you've now found this out the hard way. The preemption law will stand, and Michigan can get about the business of advancing its economy. The only thing you ought to be worried about, Mr. Martis, is what the frackers are going to do with you, because they're quite ruthless and they like to leave the wounded behind. So I don't know that if you have funding ties, you're going to get to keep them. John, story number 2.
Oh, gosh. Yeah, you were real fired up about that one this week, weren't you? I got the 9 p.m. text of, "Look at this idiot." It's something along those lines. I can't remember what you said.
I don't think I used that disparaging term. Please do not put words in my mouth, Mr. Engel.
All right. A second story comes from The Independent, titled "World's Biggest Solar Farm Goes Online, Big Enough to Power a Country." Mike.
Yeah. This is big. This is a really big project, an astounding 5 gigawatts added to China's grid. It's a staggering amount of power, equivalent to the energy used by a country the size of Luxembourg or Papua New Guinea. Regular listeners know that China has been making huge investments in solar, despite the bloviating of U.S. politicians from the ideology over reality crowd. In fact, China added as much solar capacity last year as the entire world did in 2022. I think it's safe to say that China is playing the long game on the energy sources of tomorrow, and we ignore that at our peril. John, what do you think?
Yeah, and as we've discussed on this show before, China is manufacturing an enormous amount of solar, and a big part of their growth strategy is to build tons of huge infrastructure projects. So this makes a lot of sense that we might see even bigger projects in China down the line. And I'll give the Factor This tease here because it applies. Good friend of, I'd say both of ours, Christian Roseland from Clean Energy Associates is coming on Factor This to talk about this latest tariff case and why it's probably even worse than the one we just survived with Oxen Solar. So tune into that on Monday. All right, Mike, what's our third story?
Jack Ewing at the New York Times, how electric car batteries might aid the grid and win over drivers. This is a cool story, I got to say, John.
Yeah, Ford, GM, and other automakers are exploring how EV batteries can store renewable energy when it's abundant to help utilities handle supply and demand fluctuations. EV owners would be compensated if they opt into a program that charges their batteries when power is cheap because of solar and wind generation, then sells that power back to the grid when there's less renewable generation and prices are high. It's managed charging or flexible charging, as you'll probably hear about it in a lot of places. This would lead automakers to profit and help stabilize the grid at the same time. Plus, it could benefit EV owners with a new source of cash. Mike, what do you think?
EV prices are higher than gas-powered electric vehicles because of battery costs, but these new EV battery storage incentives could save consumers enough money to make the prices more comparable, driving more EV adoption, and people can use their EV batteries as backup power for their homes during an outage. Electric vehicles are often framed as a challenge for the grid as they'll add a lot of new demand, but this could flip that logic on its head. EVs help the grid become more resilient. They improve the economics of wind and solar generation in this scenario. And the challenge here is that the grid was designed for central generation. I think the whole clean energy transition is struggling with that reality. You have big power plants feeding electricity in one direction to their end users. That's the legacy model. Having power flow in two directions increases the complexity of managing the system, but it also increases the potential benefits. So I really think this is going to be a trend we'll be watching, John, for quite a while and how this plays out.
Yeah, and the utilities are doing the same thing. So a lot of them will have these opt-in programs where they say, let me control your charging. And the benefit to them, even if they do give you, some cash, is the deferral of upgrades. That's the big play for them, is that if a couple of Teslas show up on one feeder, it's screwed. And that can happen really fast, and it's difficult to predict. Our fourth story is written by This Week in Cleantech alum Shannon Osaka from the Washington Post, titled, How a Simple Fix Could Double the Size of the U.S. Electricity Grid. Reconductoring is very hot in media and in think tank publications right now, Mike.
It is. All right. So we're riding the trend here. We talk a lot on the show about how important it is to expand transmission. It's one of the 9 big barriers to the clean energy transition. The lack of transmission is part of why we're currently at over 2.6 terawatts of power stuck waiting to connect to the grid, 95% of which are solar, battery, and wind projects. That's twice as much as the country's existing generation capacity. It takes us about 10 years to build a new transmission line, but a lot of the existing infrastructure is pretty old, and if it's upgraded properly, it could double power flows, reducing the need for new power lines. Reconductoring, as you have coined that word, John, could cut the amount of new power lines we need up to 80%, which is a pretty big deal.
And to be clear, reconductoring is basically new power lines. What we're talking about is not building new infrastructure, the towers and the whole thing. Yep. This is a cost-effective solution considering it is half the price of building brand new transmission. Plus, it can be done a lot faster, allowing us to add renewables to the grid sooner. We're on our way to making this a reality. So just last month, the Biden administration announced the goal to upgrade 100,000 miles of transmission over the next 5 years. It's high time we replaced the century-old wiring with modern, more efficient technology. And a very important point to round this story out, it is also not a reason to not build new transmission. We need new transmission in addition to some of these technology advancements like reconductoring or dynamic line ratings, grid enhancing technologies. All of this should be considered in a suite to get as much capacity as we can. We know we need 2 to 3 times as much as we've got by like 2035. So that's coming quick. All right, Mike, our last one.
I'm going to tell ACP and C to snippet what you just said and send it to every Senate office. They need to hear from you, John.
Okay, I'm sure they're already listening, as we usually point out. We have the ear of Washington on the show.
We can't even get David Wallace Wells or Alex Kaufman and get on the show.
If you say his name again, he's going to show up in like your bathroom mirror because you've been talking about him so much on this show. He's never coming on. I honestly, Mike, I don't want him to ever come on this show because now we have a bit.
You're just butthurt that I'm going to get him on the show and you didn't. I'll bet you $5 right now he
All
comes
right.
on the show.
Speaking of people who probably wish they weren't coming on the show, do you want to introduce our reporter this week?
Dharna Norr from The Guardian wrote, game-changing, Vermont becomes the first state to require big oil to pay for climate damages. Dharna, welcome. Thank you for injecting some adult supervision into this daycare center.
No.
And we are really glad to have you. So can I ask, our standard question here is, if people have made the mistake of not yet reading your story, which we want them to do, what is the big takeaway they should have in mind?
The big takeaway is, first of all, I'm sorry that I'm not David Wallace Wells or Alex Kaufman.
No, we wanted you here. We wanted you here.
Got it. The big takeaway here is really, I mean, there's a piece of legislation that just became law in Vermont could be a real game changer. Vermont just became the first state to enact this law that will hold oil firms financially responsible for climate damages. So essentially, holding big oil firms accountable financially for the role that their emissions have played in hurricanes and floods and storms and things like this.
Dharna, how are they going to do that? So, like, what's the structure of this fund? How will they, calculate the penalties, and how will all that play out?
Yeah, so basically the state is going to have until 2026 to come together with, climate experts and engineers and a bunch of other experts to total up the cost to the state from greenhouse gases that were emitted between 95 and 2024. So, from like more than a decade ago to now, they'll look at the costs on public health and biodiversity, economic development, like, how many homes or bridges had to be repaired. And then they'll use like federal data to determine how much to charge individual polluters for those harms. So they'll total up the damage done by emissions, and then they'll say, okay, well, how many of those emissions actually came from these major oil companies, these major gas companies? How much can we charge them reasonably for those harms?
Dharna, I've got several friends who have been involved in the effort to bring the oil and gas industry to account through litigation. And it looks like it's been a really tough slog, and they've done a great job at getting the documents out in the public, showing that ExxonMobil knew many years ago they were going to cook the planet, and then they went ahead and did it anyway. How do you see this major step fitting into the whole arc of this legal accountability strategy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think in some ways, this legislation is a really different way to get at some of the same things that the litigation is aiming to get at. So, if you talk to the folks behind the sort of big oil lawsuits, they'll say that the purpose is not really just to punish big oil for emissions or something like this. It's specifically focused on this deception campaign. There's lots of evidence behind these allegations that big oil knew for decades about the dangers that their products were causing. And rather than share that information from the public, they actually did everything they could to hide that information from the public, sow doubt in ads and in advertorials, in sort of, public-facing statements and things like this. And the idea is that those lawsuits could force big oil to help pay for climate damages because they reasonably knew about the damages that their products would cause. The litigation kind of gets to a similar place, but through a pretty different method. So while it's not completely unrelated to the sort of alleged like decades of misinformation from big oil, it focuses really specifically on the emissions, not on the on the sort of public-facing information, not on the alleged deceit, but specifically on the emissions. It's not completely unrelated to those documents that we have showing what the oil industry knew about climate change, though, because, it's very different to say that oil companies will have to pay for, emissions that they knew could cause damage than to say that, a company has to pay for damages caused by something that we had no idea was going to be a problem. So, it does draw on some of the same sort of conclusions and that body of work, but takes a pretty different approach, and one that it seems, has had some successes, although could have some challenges moving forward too.
Despite record-breaking, multi-billion-dollar profits each quarter, the oil and gas industry is not one to sit by and just pay their tab. So what's been the initial response from industry, if any? Are they maybe quiet in this initial period after the announcement, or are there already those tactics surfacing on here's how we're going to fight back?
Well, long before the legislation actually was passed in Vermont, and I should say Vermont is the one that has passed this legislation, but there are other states, Maryland and California and Massachusetts and New York that are weighing similar initiatives. There are some sort of federal pending proposals from Senator Bernie Sanders and others. So Big Oil is definitely watching this, not only in Vermont. And long before the success in Vermont, it sort of, laid out these pretty clear statements about how it was going to push back on the legislation in the courts. So we can definitely expect some pretty big court challenges. API, that's the American Petroleum Institute, the sort of biggest oil and gas lobby group in the United States, has made it very clear that this is not going down without a fight. And, if you talk to advocates in Vermont, they say that they've constructed a bill that will be able to hold up pretty robustly, at least to those legal challenges, but we'll have to see what the future holds.
Jon, I've learned something new today, that the oil companies don't pay their tab. I'm going to ask Brian to change your moniker to Captain Obvious, because I think that's a better term.
I thought that was a good segue. What are you talking about? We almost got through this without me trying to quit again. All right, why don't you wrap us up?
We are about out of time. It's time for Cleantech of the Week, John Engel.
Yeah, for the very last time, our Cleantecher of the Week is Jon Powers, co-founder of CleanCapital. Jon spearheaded a signature effort involving over 300 clean energy business leaders, urging congressional leadership to enhance the IRA and abandon any plans of a repeal. So congratulations, Jon, and go listen to his podcast, because he's a good podcast host too.
Yeah, awesome leadership effort, Jon Powers. This was terrific. Dharna, great reporting. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.
And we want to thank our wonderful producer, Brian Mendez, and Claire Quirin, and Alex Peterson for their help in gathering these stories.
Yeah, and send in those story recommendations and Cleantecher of the Week nominations to rew@clarionevents.com. If we have another episode of this show, we will use those recommendations then. All right, Mike, Dharna, thank you so much.
Take care.